Hello, everyone. My name is Glenn Deason from the University of Southeastern Norway. Today is Tuesday, the 24th of January, and with me is Colonel Douglas Macgregor. So from the top echelons of the US military, obviously you have great insights into what is happening around the world, also in the Ukrainian war. And also, as you're retired, you can speak more freely and more freely than others. And you're also renowned for this, for being candid. So, Colonel, it's a great pleasure. Welcome. Good to see you again, and thank you for coming on.
Sure.
So, I thought we could start by me asking you about the current state of the war, because, well, given that this has been a war of attrition, at least since the peace agreement was sabotaged in April, what is the current state of this war? How does the Ukrainian army and the Russian army stand so far? Last we spoke, the Russians were in the middle of well, they had begun their mobilization and preparing entirely new regiments.
Yes. Well, the state of the war. I think the state of the war is as follows. Your viewers will recall that finally in April, President Putin and his advisors concluded that there was no hope for any sort of negotiated settlement. They simply had no negotiating partner. And it was abundantly clear that Washington and London in particular would act to sabotage any negotiated settlement. And at that point, they had to confront some tough decisions, which they did not initially anticipate. And that is that they'd have to fight longer, harder, and ultimately destroy most of, if not all of, the Ukrainian armed forces. So you went through this process of then consolidating control over the areas that we're familiar with in southern Ukraine, some withdrawals from areas that had no real strategic value, that were stretching Russian ground forces beyond their reasonable capacity to hold. So they gave up some territory, consolidated their positions, and then the Ukrainians began one long series of counterattacks, starting with counterattacks in the size of 30 and 40,000 that eventually became 9 or 10,000, that eventually dropped down to 3 or 4,000, and then even to 1,000 or less. And we now think that the Russians, in the way they operated in this economy of force measure in the defense, have essentially invited the Ukrainians to attack them and annihilated most of what remained of the regular Ukrainian army that began the war. And there are different kinds of sources out there that you can check. People are checking obituaries inside Ukraine. They're looking at hospitals. There are people walking around in hospital wards. And it looks like the Ukrainians have lost at least 125,000 killed in action, plus Ukrainians have 35,000 men missing in action and presumed dead. So you're talking about over 150,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed, plus several 100,000 casualties. The hospitals are bursting at the seams with the wounded. So the Ukrainian armed forces are in a lot of trouble. At the same time, the Russians began a series of strikes on every other day, every 3 days, every 4 days, whatever they thought was necessary. And contrary to what the West seemed to think, or what was at least said publicly, they did not run out of missiles, rockets, and artillery ammunition or anything else. And they began to systematically reduce the infrastructure in Ukraine that could be used against them. Communications, transportation, ammunition, storage areas, command and control targets, and so forth. Meanwhile, this massive mobilization that you mentioned has been largely completed, although I still continue to get reports of mobilization beyond the 300,000 that is being carried out very quietly, but nevertheless is real. So there are different estimates on how many forces are now arrayed around on the periphery of Ukraine. But we can say with some accuracy, it's over 600,000, probably closer to 650. We don't know how much we should include that sits inside Russia simply in support in terms of transportation, logistical infrastructure. The Russians have definitely committed to total war, or nearly total war. And the Ukrainians at the same time are now essentially being bled to death and at an absolute low point, which is why you see this mad rush in the West to somehow or another make up for the tremendous human and material losses that the Ukrainians have taken. And that's the genesis of these armaments and platform packages that you've been hearing about over the last several weeks. The problem with most of these packages, by the way, is that in many cases, the bulk of the promised equipment and certainly the bulk of munitions will not arrive at any time to make a difference to the Ukrainians over the next 6 months. It takes many, many months to build and deliver many of the missiles that are used. The AMRAAM missile, AMRAAM that is produced by Raytheon, from the time you place an order until the missile arrives takes 32 months. That's a very long time for substantial numbers of AMRAAM missiles to arrive for use by either NASAMS, the National Air Defense System that we built and that you also build in Norway is a very excellent system. We just don't have that many missiles, and they're very difficult to build and very difficult to build quickly. That's the tip of the iceberg. I think the Ukrainians have gone through several years of Javelin production, and there too, we have a long wait for any more Javelins. When it comes to these expensive munitions, like Excalibur, there are limited quantities, and once again, they take time to produce. All of it's very expensive. It's very time-consuming. And then, of course, you have the tank nonsense. Got to send Ukrainians tanks when, at least in theory, they still have over 1,000 tanks at their disposal, most of which are former Soviet tanks, having lost several thousand, we admit that, but they still have over 1,000 tanks supposedly in their inventory. How anyone thinks that 14 Challenger tanks or 14 Leopard tanks or 14 M1s will make any damn difference is beyond my imagination. When you talk about 14 tanks, assuming that you can move them hundreds of kilometers to the front and then sustain them by moving repair parts and then bringing back equipment to be repaired, probably in Poland or Germany, this sort of thing just doesn't add up to much. And I think privately, I'm getting the feeling that people in Washington have concluded that Ukraine is very definitely going to lose this war. I don't think that's really open for debate any longer. And so you have the public face that says, oh, no, we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian, and we're going to provide everything we can because we have to, or bloodthirsty, evil Russia will overrun Europe, which, of course, is nonsense. But at the same time, you have the feeling that in Washington, we've got to get the most out of our investment in this Ukraine proxy war. And you do that by postponing an end to the conflict. You drag it out and drag it out and drag it out, which of course means, millions of people who've already been displaced and millions inside Ukraine, their lives are destroyed, more dead, more wounded, and Ukraine as a state is probably going to be reduced to ruins. But that seems to be the strategy or the goal of the current strategy, if you want to call it that. Now, you mentioned attrition. And yes, attrition plays a role in every war. It's not something that you opt for all the time or you look for, but there's the aspect of attrition is always there. And attrition is balanced by maneuver. But maneuver only works if you can control the airspace, you can protect your forces on the ground. Those are things that the Ukrainians are having enormous difficulty doing. And you have an enormous overmatch in terms of artillery systems, rockets, missiles, hard shell ammunition on the Russian side. The Russians are now capable of firing up to roughly 60,000 rounds a day. And the Ukrainians are lucky if they can get 6,000 to 7,000 rounds out there in response to the Russian artillery attacks. And it looks like about 75% of all the casualties and dead that the Ukrainians have taken to this point are the result of strikes by artillery systems, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, rocket artillery systems. So this is a very grim assessment, and you would hope that someone cared enough about Ukraine to try to find a way to bring this to an end, but the outrageous demands, unrealistic goals from the very beginning that are designed to both humiliate and destroy Russia are simply unattainable. But no one will publicly admit that, least of all Washington.
Well, from United States to Poland, there's been a lot of talk about the need to weaken Russia permanently, bleed it. So again, the way one speaks about the proxy war. So what are then the damages for the Russians? You mentioned more than 150,000 dead Ukrainians, and this was based on, is this open sources or how?
Yes, you can get this from open source. You got to look at obituaries. you have to have information, hard data provided to you by people on the ground who are looking at the individuals in the hospitals, people that get into and view morgues. You know, the 35,000 missing figure has accidentally been revealed by the Ukrainian army on more than one occasion. You know, to this, you've got to add in the troops that they're sending to the front now are in most cases people that are frankly too old or infirm to fight, in many cases too young to be there, under the age of 17. 16 is ridiculous. And then you have these dragooning operations, what we used to call in the old days of the Royal Navy, press gangs, that go out through various towns and cities. They even go to discos, clubs, bars at night and try to round up more men that they can shove into uniform. That outcome is particularly damaging because these Ukrainian soldiers are reporting that as soon as they go into action, nobody really knows what they're doing. The officers, in many cases, and NCOs that are there only stay with them briefly. And when it turns sour and they start to take losses, the experienced officers at NCOs are nowhere in sight and they're annihilated. In this recent, I would say, small-scale attack down in Zaporizhia, Russian soldiers reported for the first time that they'd seen Ukrainian soldiers throw away their weapons and run. And that wasn't because suddenly Ukrainians are cowards. It's because these are people that just don't have any training. And under the circumstances, what would you expect them to do? They don't particularly care to die. So I think the straits are really dire. Now, you mentioned Russia. We think that there may be between 16 to 25,000 Russian dead. The huge figures that are issued by Kyiv and Washington and London and New York are nonsense. The Russians simply have not taken huge casualties. They have perhaps 40 to 50,000 wounded at the most. So this hasn't made much of a dent to the Russian military by any stretch of the imagination. And many of those who were wounded a few months ago are returned to duty. And of course, that's part and parcel for the way this entire campaign is being fought from day one. Ukraine is winning. Ukraine is winning. The Russians are losing. The Russians are losing. The Russians are dying. The Ukrainians are winning. And it's all nonsense. It's never been the case. And the losses are horrific. And we've reached this strategic inflection point where there have to be some decisions made as to whether or not this continues until Ukraine is destroyed or something else happens.
And this 16 to 24,000, is it the Russian army, or does it include the Wagner and Donbas militia, or is it
that includes everybody?
Oh, yeah.
And again, remember that the regular Russian army has not seen that much action. And I'm glad you brought that point up, that most of the casualties have been taken by the Donetsk, Luhansk militias that you pointed to, the Wagner group, and by many volunteer units. It's only recently that we've begun to see, as with the case for the offensive towards Zaporozhye, and an entirely Russian regular army fighting force attacking. And they've done very well. I mean, contrary to popular belief, the notion that the Russians are incompetent and stupid and don't know what they're doing is equally ridiculous. And I don't see any evidence that the Russians have ever said anything about the Ukrainians that was bad. They've always recognized the Ukrainians are good fighters, but they simply point out that they're overmatched, and they are. You can be the most dynamic and courageous soldier in the world. Clearly, the soldiers in the German Wehrmacht fought to the bitter end in the last year of the war. They were competent and they were certainly very courageous in most cases, but you don't stand up against accurate, devastating firepower very well. So much for the will to power, if you will. It doesn't count for much when the overhead surveillance and the artillery systems and the strike systems are destroying you. By the way, in the offensive down in Zaporozhye, the Russian Air Force has been flying sorties to the point where they're only 300 or 400 feet above the deck. In other words, right off the ground, delivering their strikes against Ukrainians, which indicates that all the missiles and the various systems for air defense have been largely destroyed, or simply are not able to fire because they don't have the munitions. That's another very important development.
Well, you're definitely right about this problem with recruitment in Ukraine, that because across the Ukrainian Telegram channels, there's been a lot of videos coming up about people effectively dragged off the streets or from their homes by the military. And even the Hungarian government complained that within the ethnic Hungarian region in the western part of the country, they used the word kidnapping to describe, because they sent the army at local markets, they surrounded them, and essentially dragged away all the men to throw them in uniform. Now, this obviously, yeah, it's a way of getting the numbers up, but definitely the quality of troops, their preparedness to fight would not be as good as the initial elite troops, which they, had more, fought more with ideology behind them. But I was curious about, you mentioned the Zaporozhye front and all. I thought it's interesting with recent developments, because the Russians recently took this strategic town of Soledar, and is advancing to the surrounding regions. And then further south, Russia recently took Lyshivka and is advancing a bit north to Chasiv Yar. So this is starting to look like a pincer movement around all of Bakhmut city. Indeed, some people are saying that there's an operational encirclement already, even though there's still one road left they can leave on. And in the south, it appears that Russia activated this Zaporozhye front line and moved several kilometers north. But with still hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers not yet having entered the fight. How are you reading this? Is this the beginning of the Russian winter offensive, or they're just choosing their positions before they storm, or what? Or will there be a huge offensive? Will it continue to be this gradual grinding down the army? How do you read the situation based on your background?
Well, if you look at the map and you look at the size of these operations, people call them operational. I suppose you could make that argument, but these are small scale. They're what we call shaping operations, where you are deliberately destroying the various lines of defense. It's generally accepted that the Ukrainians have 3 lines of defense in the Donbass. The first 2 are largely destroyed, and the third is not very strong and has turned out to be relatively weak, which is why I think you're seeing these sudden advances. And of course, they're running out of people. And I'm sure Ukrainian commanders have argued that this is the time to withdraw forces to prevent them from being destroyed, so that we can build up a viable reserve force and we can fall back to defensible terrain. But again, this is the problem. If we fall back, is the argument in Kiev, well, then we're seen as weak, and that people will think we can't win. Well, people have already reached that conclusion at high levels as it is. So no, these are shaping operations. The major offensives, you're looking at over 100,000 combat troops down in the south that will advance north. You can look at where these shaping operations have occurred, and you can make up your mind where you think these advances will come from in the south. You have another 100,000 combat troops over near Beograd that are faced across from Kharkov, and those are poised to attack. And they stretch all the way down to the Oxal River. Then you have another roughly 80 to 100,000 Russian combat troops in Belarus. I'm not as confident of those numbers, because it may be more, it may be less. It's hard to see up there right now. Even the people with satellite overhead views are having difficulty with precise numbers, but we've seen an enormous quantity of equipment arrive there, all of it brand new. The same thing in the other areas, but certainly in Belarus. And then people say, well, I hear lots of people say, well, they can execute a 3-pronged, super envelopment from the north out of Belarus, from the east in central Ukraine, and from the south in southern Ukraine. Well, I suppose you could, but I don't see that as the Russian way of war at this stage. I think that you will see something on a larger scale associated with the slow, deliberate meat grinder approach that is being applied with great success in southern Ukraine. Now, if there are large openings and vast open spaces, and if you look at the map, and people really need to study the maps in Ukraine. I remember months ago, we had Army retired generals coming on talking about, the Ukrainians are doing such a brilliant job, and just look at these pictures. And all those pictures were nonsense. It was just GameStop crap. If you look at the terrain north of Zaporozhye, it's flat. There is some undulating terrain, but most of it is pretty flat. I don't know what's up there, and I'm getting the impression more and more every day that there isn't really very much there. And if that indeed is the case, you might see something greater than the sort of slow, deliberate grind. You may see a more rapid advance. But the Russians have proven over the last few months to be very deliberate. They understand the impact of linking the overhead intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, terrestrial and space-based, to the various strike systems. They've used their Air Force very effectively as well as part of this larger strike approach. I don't see that changing very much. I don't think they're going to put ground forces at risk of being suddenly attacked by weapons and troops that they have not already identified by moving too quickly. But those slow, deliberate grinds will have an effect. My own thinking is that we're going to see all of this happen in the East first. And when the East is largely devoid of Ukrainian resistance and cleared, that's when you will see crossing of the Dnieper River and the northern offensive begin, because one of the stated goals from the very beginning of this discussion about offensives has been to cut off Ukraine from the Polish border. That has to happen. And something is going to have to be done about the regime in Kiev, but that will be the last thing that I think is on the agenda.
Yeah, well, because it definitely seems from looking at the map that the Zaporozhye front has to be something real, because again, if you move north from Zaporozhye, you can cut off Zaporozhye, Dnipro, all the way up to Kyiv, then everything east of the Dnieper would be cut off. Yeah, I was wondering though, because the Russians may have the men now up to 600,000, but if they would activate all of them at the same time, wouldn't this put a huge strain on the manufacturing logistics of the supply of weapons? Because one of the advantages of Russia now is they can just fire off all the artillery, the rockets they want, but that's because they have the production, in the back. But if all their men would be armed to the teeth with the same kind of firepower, could they sustain this, or does this indicate that they would probably do a slower, grinding mission?
My impression is the manufacturing facilities for all these weapon systems are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in Russia. As a result, there will be no shortage. That's wishful thinking. That's the least of your concerns, or of their concerns. The larger issue is what we talked about before. Given what they have learned over the last several months, warfare has clearly changed. The dominant feature on the battlefield is what we call ISR strike, this integration of the overhead surveillance at every level with multiple strike systems. That becomes, if you will, a huge umbrella over the entire Ukrainian state area. The Russians are not going to move their forces anywhere that they are not under that umbrella. Therefore, the movements will not be mad dashes to seize a bridge over the Dnieper. These will be, I don't want to say slow, but methodical, deliberate. And it will move under the crushing weight of these strike systems. That's why this is not going to end in 30 days. It's not going to end in 60 days. It may be 90 or 120, simply because they are being methodical, and they will destroy all of the Ukrainian resistance. But it just won't look like a World War II blitzkrieg. I keep hearing people talk about blitzkrieg. That was a different era, and that kind of capability exists, but it's not something that you do in this era where you have ISR strike arrayed against you. And even though the Ukrainian capabilities are much degraded and denuded of what they had earlier, it's still a danger. And the Russians have made it very clear, the commanding generals have made it clear, they're not interested in sacrificing Russian lives unnecessarily. So they'll be methodical and they'll be deliberate, as opposed to on the fly or battlefield opportunists in the old German sense of the word. But I see the eastern side taking presidents first over the West. That doesn't mean they won't go west. I think they'll have to. And every day that we open our mouths and characterize the Russians in the very negative way that we do, and make these outrageous demands of them, and keep talking about regime destruction and dismemberment of Russia as the long-term goal, the more likely it becomes that the Russians will have to move all the way to the Polish and Romanian and Moldovan borders.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask about, because can there really be negotiations anymore? Because I often look at Moscow's perspective, and from that perspective, NATO countries, they sabotaged the previous Minsk II agreement for 7 years, And then again, when Russia invaded to impose a settlement, the US and UK convinced Kyiv to, again, abandon negotiations. So there's quite little trust in Moscow at the moment. And also the fear obviously would be that if there would be a peace, the West would merely do as it did with the last agreement, simply use it as an opportunity to arm Ukraine to the teeth again and, continue the fight. But again, and this is what we're indicating quite often, speaking a bit too openly, perhaps. But making matters worse, now we also declare this intention that we're gonna, fight Russia in perpetuity, and give even NATO membership to Ukraine after the war. Even Henry Kissinger suggested this in Davos. So this places, Moscow in a very difficult position, because whatever territory it does not take now will end up in NATO's hands. So, and also, it would be dangerous to have two strategic territory which would be used against it, which suggests Russia would have, all the incentive to seize the coastline, to take the areas of economic interest, that is the agriculture, the industrial areas, the areas with natural resources, and obviously the regions with the Russian speakers, as they wouldn't want them to live under a, NATO rules. So, so given that we're declaring this goal of breaking Russia, what does this mean for negotiations? Can there be any settlement now that we see, some cracks in Ukraine?
Well, on the face of it, it would suggest no, because there's no one that the Russians are inclined to believe at this stage. I mean, how much faith should they put in anything that is said by Zelensky or Biden, or Biden's cabinet members and his government? For that matter, it probably also applies to London and perhaps other European governments. Your own is another example, and then there's Finland. This attitude that somehow or another, overnight, Russia must be destroyed. It's interesting because I was reading a document that was authored by George Soros over 10 years ago, in which he talked specifically about this kind of all-out war that would ultimately come against Russia, because he said this is the last nationalist state that rests on a foundation, obviously, of Orthodox Christian culture with Russian identity at its core. That has to be removed. So I think the people that are in charge of the West and in charge in Washington think that they have successfully destroyed the national identities of the European and American peoples, that we have no sense of ourselves, our borders are undefended, we present no resistance to incoming migrants from the developing world, who essentially roll over us as though we owe them a living, and that our laws do not count. Thus far, I would say that's a pretty good assessment, an accurate evaluation of what we've been doing. And I think that's a great victory for George Soros and the globalists, the anti-nationalists, those who want open borders, and they call it an open society, which means that you end up with nothing, an amorphous mass of people struggling to survive, who are reduced to the lowest levels of subsistence. So that's in the background. And in fact, he even goes so far as talking about how useful it would be if East Europeans were the ones that whose lives were expended in this process, and not West Europeans who simply will not take the casualties. This is not a minor matter. This is the sort of thinking that is so destructive and so evil, in my judgment, that's really what we are dealing with in our own countries, and I think Putin recognizes that. So for him, it's existential, and I think the Russian people see it this way. These reports of, oh, the Russians are miserable and want to get rid of Putin. I guess you can find somebody over there. I don't know how many, but certainly in the high 80s, he has approval ratings, and I'd say that if anybody tried to remove the man, he'd probably be killed or cut down long before he got near the Kremlin by Russians who strongly support what's happening. I think they know their survival is at risk. So you're talking about irreconcilable differences, Glenn. And now, could this change? Of course. The United States, I think, in many ways is on course for a financial or economic Pearl Harbor. The $32 trillion sovereign national debt is not inconsequential. The argument that economics have changed and debt doesn't matter, well, I think people are in for a real rude awakening on that one. that could have a big impact here. Because if you look at spending, it is more out of control and outrageous here in this country than at any point in our history. And there are millions of Americans watching the money disappear into the black hole called Ukraine and don't understand why our borders are open, why our police forces are not allowed to enforce the law, why the Biden government won't enforce the law. I think there are Europeans that are worried about some of these things, perhaps not exactly the same way, but in France and Germany, we have evidence from millions of people demonstrating in streets in Prague and elsewhere in the Western world. Those things could change governments. There's no question about it. And we should not underestimate the economic, financial impact of future crises. If you had a fundamental change in governments that more accurately reflected the attitudes and opinions of most people in Europe, and I would argue here, which in that public opinion, I think, is we'd like to see a negotiated settlement and we don't want to go to war with Russia. You could see those governments come to power and that would change things. But, I don't know when that would happen, under what circumstances precisely, but I think the potential for that grows with each passing day. And that's the only way out, frankly, because the Russians have no one to negotiate with at this point, as you rightly point out.
Well, there's definitely some divisions appearing, also in the United States with a Republican-controlled House of Representatives we see now, but also the statistics you see less and less.
Well, I wouldn't overstate. No? I wouldn't overstate the Republican control of the House. When you look at the Republicans, most of them are quite happy to line their pockets with cash, just like the Democrats, as a result of this mammoth wealth transfer that's going on with Ukraine and the Department of Defense and the national defense industries. They're also happy to take donations from the Chamber of Commerce and others who want the cheap labor. In other words, there's still large numbers of people in both parties willing to cooperate to keep the status quo going, because the status quo enriches the Washington community. If you want to understand why people do the things they do here in Washington, I can't speak for the Europeans, but I can speak for the Americans. Follow the money. Where the money leads tells you what they're going to do. And right now, they don't have any incentive to intervene and stop. You have a minority of Republicans inside the so-called Republican-dominated House that want to stop it. There are only a few senators, perhaps 11 or 12, perhaps 30 or 40 Republicans in the House. Everyone else is happy to sign on. There's another point here, and this is something that doesn't come up much. Americans, and I think probably Europeans, have lost their fear of war. I don't think they understand what real war means. Remember that all of our operations, certainly over the last 40, 50 years, certainly the last 30, have more in common with British or French colonial expeditions into the developing world when they held empires than they do with fighting a capable nation-state opponent. We haven't taken on that sort of enemy before, and that's why with Russia, it's different. And I still think there are lots of Americans in Washington who don't understand that. They dismiss out of hand that Russia is a state that can mobilize its entire population for war. And they will do it if they see no alternative, and they will be supported by many others, not the least of which are the Chinese. And I don't think we understand what that means, because we haven't seen anything like that since 1945.
Oh, you're right. I think it's been 30 years of fighting weak adversaries. So Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen. Of course, now this great power conflict with Russia and China, obviously something very different. But that's also why I wanted to ask you if you think, NATO seems to be prepared to cross, more and more of these red lines. And is there anyone holding this back in Washington? Because again, I see this reports now in the U.S. media that the U.S. will support long-distance weapon, and I assume the intelligence to direct these weapons to strike Crimea. At least the paper suggests Biden is warming up to attacking Crimea, through the Ukrainians, of course, and might even go deeper into Russian territory. That is, which is making the Russians set up air defense systems all the way into Moscow. And again, we seem to cross new red lines every day, and I just wonder how far Russia can be pushed, because I'm reminded of this interview by the former head of Russia analysis at the CIA, something. He gave this interview to Radio Free Europe, in which he argued, again, and this was in December of 2021, 2 months before the Russian invasion. He argued that Russia could feel pushed towards invading, and the reason was because the US was creating essentially a fortress in Ukraine by supplying weapons, training, and even modernizing Ukrainian ports so they can fit the US warships. His argument was that time was not on Russia's side. That was his word. So, in other words, the risk Russia faced by not invading Ukraine was being outweighed by the risk. The risk faced by invading Ukraine was being outweighed by the risk of not invading Ukraine. In other words, it couldn't afford to see this huge NATO buildup on its border. So, I was wondering if NATO now is creating a similar position for Russia, because we set up this ability now that we can strike Russia and kill Russians almost with impunity, with the assumption that they would never dare to strike back at us. But we keep crossing this new red line. So my question would be, when do we reach the level when Russia believes that the risk of striking NATO would be, or at least some training camp in Poland would be outweighed by the risk of not striking NATO? Again, not a full-out war, but finding a way of punishing us for, stepping over this red line. So, the need effectively to deny NATO this, immunity from retaliation. Do you see this? You can only stretch this spring so far before it lashes back. I'm just wondering when are we reaching this? Because I'm already seeing a lot of different rhetoric now among the Russian leadership, especially former President Medvedev becoming much more aggressive in his language. I was just curious, when do we reach the point when Russia strikes back?
Well, there are two things that deserve to be addressed in this context. One is, as long as the European states inside NATO behave like loyal vassal states of Washington, I suppose this can continue without interruption until someone who leads a European state stands up and categorically refuses to participate, makes the points that you have, and frankly argues that there's a dramatic divergence of interest between the Europeans and Americans when it comes to Russia. That hasn't happened. If that doesn't happen, then I would say what you described is accurate and will continue. Secondly, it's funny you bring this up because a couple of historians asked to meet with me. They sent me all these emails saying it's important we talk. They described exactly what you did. How many measures can we apply before we finally cross the so-called Rubicon into real war? And they went back over the things that Franklin Roosevelt did in his administration during the 1930s in the run-up to the war with Japan, because there was no appetite in the United States to go to war with Germany. In fact, most people in the United States in the 30s were convinced that our war with Germany had been a serious mistake in 1917 and 1918. So there was enormous opposition to it. And there was certainly no interest. There wasn't even that much awareness of the Japanese, to be frank. And he talked about the various measures that were adopted up to and including the oil embargo. But he mentioned something called the McCullum Memorandum, these two historians. And that was a secret memorandum that was issued to the Department of the Navy. I don't know if Marshall saw it. I'm sure he probably did. But it essentially listed provocative things, provocative measures that should be embraced, with the clear and unambiguous goal of goading the Japanese into attacking us. And one of those was to send the United States Navy into Japanese waters in small numbers, in groups. And Roosevelt was actually told by the CNO, the chief of naval operations at the time, Mr. President, this could be construed as an act of war. We could lose ships. And FDR's comment was, well, we can afford to lose 2 or 3 small vessels, destroyers, small cruisers. In other words, he was deliberately provoking the Japanese. And each time that we illegally violated their home waters with our naval forces, each time that we were flying huge quantities of bombers to the Philippines and from the Philippines to China via India in order to beef up an air force there that was effectively a Wagnerian group type air force. We call them the Flying Tigers, the most effective air force in the history of the United States that was not part of the United States Air Force. And we were going to send dozens and dozens, ultimately hundreds of bombers that would then masquerade as Chinese Air Force assets, then firebomb Japan. This was in 1939, 40, and 41. All of this is out there. So there was no question, but this was Roosevelt's back door into the war in Europe. And when it comes to Lend-Lease, we know that he approved Lend-Lease in July to the Soviets. That was illegal. We had no relationship with the Soviet Union. We were not at war with Germany, but his administration was overrun with NKVD agents and Soviet sympathizers. And so Lend-Lease to the Russians, or the Soviets at that time, began in July of 1941. And I could go on and on. So they were trying to tell me, we're looking at what the Biden administration is doing, and we think we're on the road to war with Russia. Now, is that the case? Is that the deliberate plan, policy, campaign plan? I can't say that. I don't know. Just as people at the time could not say with absolute certainty, those of us watching from the outside in the 30s, what Roosevelt was doing, although people in the military knew. I don't know. I just know that the things that you've described, the things that we are doing and plan to do in the future, are dangerous. And we should not assume that the Russians will simply sit there and take it. And I'm not talking about a nuclear exchange, because quite clearly the Russians have said over and over and over again they will not use a nuclear weapon unless one is used against them. The only caveat that was offered by Putin was that they too have space-based surveillance. They too watch our nuclear strike forces. And if they think we are readying a strike against them, and they're convinced of that, they could then potentially use a nuclear weapon against us. But barring that, in other words, if we make it clear we're not going to do that, we do not alert nuclear forces, we do not try to ready them, especially with our fleet overseas in the Adriatic and the Mediterranean, then there will be no danger of a nuclear exchange. But that doesn't exclude the high-end conventional fight that you talked about. And the cruise missiles that the Russians have, the Caliber cruise missiles, with conventional warheads, about 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead, can hit every airfield and every port in Europe except for the very south of Portugal.
So you don't believe that there's a possibility or likelihood of this escalating into a nuclear war, though? Or if it goes into a conventional war, it couldn't be a nuclear war by accident?
Well, I don't believe in nuclear wars by accident. I think the greater danger is that the Ukrainian armed forces over the next couple of months, under the weight of these Russian offensives, simply collapse. And you have another mass migration of whatever is left in Western Ukraine that heads west. And the Russians, who have no alternative, as you described earlier, but to move further west, do so. That's what I see happening. Then there is a danger of two things. One is that the buildup of our conventional forces, along with the Poles and selected other small European powers in Poland and to a lesser extent Romania, could try to intervene in Western Ukraine on the grounds that they are protecting refugees or protecting what remains of the Ukrainian state. I don't know. There's thinking like that in Washington. By the way, the Department of Defense opposes that. Everyone in the Department of Defense says that's an absolute dead end and will lead to an inevitable confrontation with the Russians, which everybody in the Department of Defense opposes. No one thinks that's a good idea, but they're not in charge. Just as the Department of Defense, in those days, it was called the Department of War. They were not in charge in 1939, 40, or 41. Franklin Roosevelt was. So, I think that's one possibility. But again, on the nuclear side, it would take a clear, unambiguous strike by the United States with a nuclear weapon against the Russians. And again, I still don't see any evidence that we've reached that level of insanity inside the Beltway here.
But is it possible? Because I'm thinking when the panic sets in, people make rash decisions, and I noticed that the Western media has changed its tune now. We're no longer talking about this unavoidable Ukrainian victory. Instead, I hear, we need to find a new game changer, which is why we're escalating. We need to turn the tide of the war. Obviously, not trying to turn the tide if you're winning. So I'm thinking if, as you say, the Ukrainian army begins to collapse, And NATO already said we can't lose this war. We have to win. We have to defeat the Russians, whatever that would entail. Could there be, rash decisions being made, or would we just stand by and see our proxy fall apart? And
well, look, you're asking what
sorry,
if,
a lot of hypotheticals.
and I can't answer that with any certainty, but clearly, New York, or excuse me, Washington, D.C., and what I would call the New York-London axis, which controls the media and intelligence, they're not going to change their approach at this stage. They're going to continue to drag this out as long as possible. They see no political benefit to themselves from announcing an end to it, because that would be an admission of what you just said. We're not winning, and it's not likely that we will win. And remember, Secretary Lloyd Austin in Ramstein, Germany, at the airbase, told the 50 donors, which included virtually all of the allies, donors to the Ukrainian military equipment and supplies and munitions and so forth, we don't have much time. This is a very short window of opportunity. Now, why would he say that? I think he's saying it because he knows that within the next couple of months, everything may move beyond the point where anything can be rescued in Ukraine. And I think that's probably true. So I think that's real. It's the first thing. Second thing is that it's difficult to address, once again, what the Europeans will do. Everyone, to be blunt with you, behind the scenes has a very low opinion of European leaders. When I was on active duty and I was involved in the Balkans, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then later on in Kosovo, the attitudes of the Americans at the highest levels of the Clinton administration towards the Europeans was reprehensible. Who cares what they think? The hell with them. They're a pain. They're trouble. We can get this done. We know what needs to be done. I've seen that before, and I'm hearing similar critical remarks made about the Europeans now. There is no sense that, well, if you live in Berlin, if you live in Riga, if you live in Copenhagen, if you live in Stockholm, Helsinki, if you live in proximity to the war, it matters. Your security is at risk. And I think large numbers of people are finding that out, which is why when you go to the consolidated public opinion polls, there are all sorts of different kinds of questions you can ask, but the key answer is always the same. We favor a negotiated settlement, number one. And then you dig deeper and we don't want a war with Russia. I think that's quite clear. And I think that George Soros was right 10, 15 years ago when he wrote that paper and essentially said that. So the only way you're going to get it is with the help of Eastern Europe. Well, you've got it with Warsaw. Though I think it's unfair to say that the Polish people as a whole are ready to strap on their guns and helmets and march east. This is not 1920, and they are not up against an existential threat in Moscow that wants to consume and destroy them, the Bolsheviks. This is different, and I think a lot of Poles know that. So I'm not sure that we have a true picture yet. We'll see how this government does in the next round of elections that are coming up. So again, it goes back to Europe. The ball is in the European court. Europeans can stop this, but don't expect London or Washington to come to your aid. Remember, Charles de Gaulle said, the problem with Great Britain is it's an island. And the problem with the United States is Americans don't live in Europe. Charles de Gaulle was right.
I think the mentality towards the European was summarized well in an article a couple of days ago in the Washington Post. Said, Germany refuses to send its Leopard tanks. Biden should not let this stand, which kind of summarized what the alliance looks like when you become a vassal state. But anyways, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, we've taken already a lot of your time, so I just wanted to thank you again for your time, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you, Glenn. Bye-bye.
Bye.